So now we know Battle Royale is coming to Battlefield, but in what form? During the EA Play press conference in the Battlefield 5 multiplayer gameplay section, Lars Gustafsson confirmed that Royale is coming. He didn't say when or what it was, but he did confirm that it's being worked on. What was made clear though is that whatever this is, it's going to be Royale reimagined for Battlefield. And about the only info we got was that it will feature the core Battlefield pillars: destruction, team play and vehicles. So potentially this could be a very different take on the Battle Royale formula that PUBG has established. The Royale announcement was met with some love and some disdain. I reckon it's a 50-50 split in the community at the moment based on what I've seen and read online. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about how this Battle Royale mode could fit into Battlefield 5, what it will most likely look like, or if it even should be a thing in the first place. So I reckon that there are quite a few ways that EA and DICE could work in a BR mode, and I'm going to put forward to you 3 scenarios in this video. So let's take a look then. Scenario number 1. Battlefield Battle Royale will simply be a new game mode that fits within Battlefield 5 itself. Just like if you quick matched into, say, Conquest or Operations, you would select Royale from the Battlefield 5 menu and search for a game. This has got a number of benefits to it, but a few drawbacks as well. As I see things, BR as a game mode in the base game would add immense value to Battlefield 5 overall. The idea of a Frostbite BR game is pretty exciting to me. We know already how popular BR games and modes are right now, so if done right and it offered up something a bit unique and fun with the Battlefield DNA thrown into the mix, and in this scenario, players who wanted to play BR mode would have to own the base game to get access to it. Again, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, this is just a theory if DICE decided to add it as a mode within BF5. So it adds value to the customer and also for EA as a bigger product. Now there are a few downsides to that though, at least in my mind. First up, a lot of the BR games out right now are free to play, excluding PUBG. Therefore I think that a large majority of Battle Royale fans who are solely interested in BR perhaps wouldn't want to pay $60 for BF5 just to play the Battle Royale mode. Why would they when they can play Fortnite for free or get PUBG on the cheap? So these guys would be the players who aren't interested in the core Battlefield experience but are fans of Battle Royale and the proposition of it on the Frostbite engine. The biggest issue for me with including it in the base game though is the difficulty that would occur attempting to separate the BR mechanics from the core game. What do I mean by this? Well, you have to assume that BR will need lots of different mechanics that you have in the base game, and perhaps some different weapon balancing amongst other things too. You have to assume the game would need a loot spawn, perhaps an armor system, the addition of a moving zone, changes to the class system, UI, gun damage, lots of different things, but the weapons may very well need to be balanced entirely differently for BR because typically it's such a different, larger experience. And doing all of these changes to the game without affecting or being limited by the core experience could be pretty tricky for the devs and confusing for the player base. That being said, DICE are very smart developers and they may already be able to add in BR with different weapon stats and extra mechanics without the need to separate it. And I think for that we'll have to see. Scenario number 2. The next option for BR I think is a community-driven early access release. The way I see you accessing this is almost as a different layer within Battlefield 5. So you load into the game and you've got the option to play BR, but rather than a separate mode, it's more like a completely different section to the base game. Either that or run it for a prolonged period of time on the CTE, assuming that BF5 has one, and build this mode together with the community, taking feedback and testing before a final release. And when I think of this particular option, the closest system that I could compare it to is COD Zombies. Zombies is pretty much accepted as a permanent addition to COD now, but it's also very separate from the base game and accepted as that. It's often not even related to the main game setting whatsoever and has very different gameplay mechanics. Now I like the idea of having a BR mode in the game, but in this scenario it's still part of BF5, but it wouldn't be constricted by the core mechanics of the base game. Still set in World War II of course though, and probably using the same guns, level assets and models. The important part of this option though is that it's community driven, and this would be very much an early access work in progress option, and along the way the community would play the game and be able to voice concerns and give feedback. And this seems like the most likely option to me going forward. If you remember the community maps that released on BF4, the development and feedback loop would operate similar to how that did. So the core BR experience and concept that DICE have envisioned would be added first to CTE, but then changes to the maps, weapons, vehicles, mechanics would all be discussed and tested with the community, and changes would be made accordingly. Look at what DICE did with Incursions as an example. Incursions right now is a completely separate client, but it's still called Battlefield 1 Incursions, and it's still Battlefield 1 at its core. That being said, because it's entirely separate, they have reworked the class system, maps, and it's pretty unrecognisable from the base game, so they could do a similar thing with Royale. Now then, scenario number 3, and this is where I think that it gets really interesting, and for me, this is the most favourable option for everyone involved. The final option we're discussing today is to make Royale an entirely separate experience to Battlefield 5 altogether, and focus on making a Frostbite Battle Royale experience rather than tying it in with BF5. Maybe you could still call it Battlefield Battle Royale, but it would be a completely separate thing to BF5. And the way I see it is that there are two major benefits to doing it this way. Benefit number 1, having it as a separate client, at least on the surface, is complete freedom over everything in the game. The UI, the weapon balance, the classes, the theme, the setting, the guns, the vehicles can all be entirely separate from the core game, and you would not be limited to the World War II era and mechanics of BF5. Therefore, I reckon that the developers would be able to be more creative, unrestrained from BF5, and ultimately deliver a better product. And benefit number 2, as a completely separate title or client, DICE and customers have more options then to sell or access this game. So it could be a free-to-play title, for example, with cosmetic-only microtransactions, just like how Fortnite does it. Or if they didn't want to go down that route, then they could offer it up at a lower price of $15 or something like that. Either way, more people could afford it this way, would be more likely to play it, and it could be free to play. And that means that you get more players and greater interest in the title, and then potentially more interest and exposure for Battlefield as a franchise. I'm fully of the opinion that if DICE developed a carbon copy clone of PUBG on the Frostbite engine as a standalone free-to-play or $15 game, the vast majority of PUBG players would just play that game instead, because you'd have better performance, better netcode, better graphics, sound, destruction. It would be glorious. In reality, I don't think that will happen, and PUBG wouldn't be too happy about it either, but it's fun to think in hypotheticals every now and again, and I do think that's true. And also DICE probably would want to create something different rather than just copying PUBG. But I hope you get my point that if you're a fan of the BR genre, the prospect of a Frostbite engine AAA studio, modern military tactical BR game is incredibly enticing. There are no alternatives like that to PUBG at the moment, and I think that if DICE do this as a proper standalone title, they've got a great opportunity to make something incredible here. If it's wrapped up within BF5 and tied to that game, I don't want it to just be a tacked on experience so DICE and EA can just tick a box that says, hey, yeah, we've got a Battle Royale mode. And I'm a bit fearful that the money men at the top are saying, well, we need this in our game because COD's got it in their game, therefore include it in BF5. That's the wrong decision in my opinion, and I think there's a much better opportunity if they did it standalone. That being said, we have to be objective about this, and there are some drawbacks to scenario 3 which I've just described. Producing something that's entirely different from your base game is not an easy task, and it would take longer to make, and that would mean that it would be longer before we could get our hands on it and play it. Say your BR mode was on Frostbite and it was based around modern day. Well, then you'd need to build new vehicle assets, environment assets, weapon assets, and all of the base game assets that you've made for BF5 wouldn't be of any use. So that seems like an awful lot of work when you could just utilise your current World War II theme. But maybe you could circumvent a large part of this though by using assets from BF4, for example. Just saying. Also, I'm sure that there are people out there who would say, well, if they make a standalone version of Battlefield Royale, why shouldn't it be in the core Battlefield 5 game as just another mode, and why do I have to pay another $15 to get it? Totally understandable, but if it were free to play, I don't see that argument standing, and more on that in a little bit too. So moving on, I wanted to go over some concerns that I've seen since the announcement of Royale for Battlefield, and one that I see quite often is a worry that introducing a BR mode into Battlefield 5 will split the player base and have an effect on matchmaking times. So let's say that if the BR mode was very good and lots of players started playing it as their go-to Battlefield experience, that might mean that the core experience could suffer. Would that mean less people playing Conquest and Operations? Maybe. Well, I've thought about this, and honestly I don't think there's an option where that can be eliminated. If it's built within the game, if it's separate, then I think the same problem would occur. If people are playing BR, regardless of if it's separate or just a new game mode, then those people are of course not playing the other game modes like Conquest or Operations anyway. Even still, a lot of players who love to play the base Battlefield game will continue to do so, because despite what you may have heard, not everyone loves Battle Royale. I personally enjoy both Conquest and BR as a new multiplayer experience. I like to dabble in both, and I'd never want to just play one over the other, and realistically I don't think any of us will ever really have to make that choice anyway. If it's a separate client, you'd have to imagine that there would also be a larger player base that perhaps would never have bought the core Battlefield game anyway because they just like BR games. Another concern I've seen online is that building a dedicated Battle Royale mode would take development time away from DICE employees working on the main game, which a lot of Battlefield fans I think are scared of. Yeah, that could be true, but I think what people aren't considering here is that in the past, DICE have worked with multiple studios and could assign a BR project to one of those if it made sense. For example, DICE LA, who worked on Incursions and also took over development of BF4 towards the end of Year 2 and Year 3, they could do it, or Battlefront 2, another DICE game, but if you remember they outsourced the single player campaign to Motive Studios and the Starfighter Assault multiplayer mode to Criterion. So what would stop them from doing something like that again with a BR mode? Now, moving on, I wanted to talk about how certain mechanics could work in a Battlefield Royale game. Vehicles, for example. PUBG of course has vehicles, but they're just transport and they're not offensive unless you run someone over with them. They get you from point A to point B. And when you're in a vehicle in PUBG, you feel pretty vulnerable, at least I do, like a sitting duck most of the time. So in a Battlefield BR, would DICE keep the same formula? I personally think that in a BR game, vehicles should just be transport vehicles only, but considering this is Battlefield, then maybe we could see some lightly armoured vehicles, or would they ever introduce full vehicle gameplay with tanks? I had this idea where during a game you and your squad could maybe find vehicle parts dotted around the map, like in DayZ, so you would find wheels, armoured parts, an engine, and then you could perhaps find an immobilised tank somewhere that you could repair and utilise. But a big problem with this is that if you've got any sort of armoured offensive vehicle in a BR game, how on earth do you balance it? Imagine if you're down to the last 10 players and the enemy squad you come up against has a tank. How frustrating would that be? You've played the perfect game and you lose because the enemy team has a armoured tank and you don't have any explosives. Now of course you could perhaps still balance it somehow by providing limited mobility or give all players certain ways of taking them down. You could even have airdrops that would bring in small vehicles or grenade launchers and RPGs. Or what about if you wanted to use a tank and fire it at the same time? It would have to be operated by multiple people, so one person driving it and another person on the cannon and then another person on the gun. Ultimately there are a number of ways that you could potentially approach this. Now let's say that you're playing BR as a 4-man squad. What if each of you had a separate role or perks, just like in the core game? One of you can pick a gadget that can take down a tank, like an anti-tank grenade or an RPG. Another of you perhaps a medic, and you can revive your downed teammates once per game. And then Scout, for instance, maybe that's the only player that can equip long-range scopes. The idea of having predetermined roles or classes at the beginning of a BR game mode in squads is something that's very interesting to me, and it would be very different from what's out there right now. It would also ensure that you really have to work as a team to survive. But then another part of me believes that a BR mode should just be about you, your ability to shoot, to move, and to outplay your opponents who are equally as equipped as you. How about fortifications too? We know that DICE have implemented the ability to build things and rebuild destroyed buildings in the Frostbite engine, and I definitely think that we'll see that come into play in Battlefield Royale. Being able to hunker down in a building or in the final circle and build up a proper defensive position could lead to some cool scenarios. And what about the esports angle too? Incursions has not been a success, and we've not heard anything yet about an Incursions mode or plans for BF5. And we've already seen several massive tournaments for PUBG and Fortnite. People seem to like the BR formula for esports as a playing experience and also as a viewing experience. So if Battle Royale is done well for Battlefield or Frostbite, there could be a big esports opportunity there. Where Incursions failed, maybe BR could succeed. So there we go guys, let me know what you think down in the comments below. What do you think out of those 3 scenarios? Which one is the most likely? And are there more options here? Of course there are, but if I talked about them all, we'd be here for bloody hours and you'd all get sick of me. So we're not going to do that, but I've broken it down. Those 3 options I think are the most likely. As I said, doing it as a standalone thing, I reckon, is the absolute best way forward, and I don't just want to see this as a tacked on experience, because with the Frostbite engine, DICE and EA have the potential here to make something truly awesome. So if you enjoyed the video, give me a like. If you didn't, a dislike. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.